In December 1979, Cedar View, Iowa, was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, trusting in their neighbors and the familiar faces that populated its streets. Winters were biting, with snow blanketing the landscapes and frigid winds cutting through the thickest of coats. Against this backdrop, the community was shaken by a brutal crime that would haunt it for decades. 18-year-old Malory Maynard was one of Cedar View's golden kids. A recent high school graduate and member of the school choir, she had a voice that captivated those who heard her sing at local events. Friendly and unassuming, Malory had recently secured a part-time job at a bookstore in the Cedar View shopping center, an occupation she planned to keep until she headed off to college the following fall. On December 12th, she stayed late to finish some extra work at the store, something she often did. However, by the following morning, her absence would lead to a horrifying discovery. It was a frigid dawn when a janitor found Malory's car parked alone in the corner of the shopping center's deserted lot. Initially, it seemed her car had merely been left overnight, but the janitor's curiosity drew him closer. The driver's side window was fogged with condensation and a strange red smear that caught his eye. When he peered inside, what he saw would be etched into his memory forever. Malory was slumped over in the front seat, her body covered in blood. She had been stabbed 29 times. The news hit Cedar View like a thunderclap. Such brutality felt alien to this town, especially for someone as beloved as Malory. The police quickly cordoned off the area and began their investigation. With the intensity of the attack and the frenzied manner of the stabbings, they immediately suspected that this was a crime of passion. The first name that came to mind was her boyfriend, Alex Simmons. 18, athletic, and deeply in love with Malory, Alex was known to have had an argument with her just days before. Witnesses claimed that voices had been raised, though the details remained murky. While some thought the fight trivial, detectives seized upon Alex as their primary suspect. Alex was brought in for questioning, his hands tested for evidence, his car meticulously examined, his alibi scrutinized, but no physical evidence linked him to the scene. Despite the high suspicion, nothing substantial could tie Alex to the crime, and the investigation ground to a disheartening halt. Cedar View was left with a bitter, unanswered question: who had taken Malory's life in such a vicious, unrelenting manner? Without physical evidence to move forward, the case was shelved, labeled as unsolved. But Malory's family, her friends, and her choir classmates kept her memory alive, hosting annual gatherings and fundraisers, each year hoping for new leads. In the cold and quiet December evenings, Cedar View grew accustomed to the idea that justice might never come for Malory. More than 2 decades passed. For many, the memory of Malory Maynard faded into Cedar View's collective history. But for her family, especially her mother, Donna Maynard, the ache remained. By 2005, however, advances in forensic technology were breaking new ground in unsolved cases across the country. DNA profiling had improved, and it wasn't long before police departments across the nation began re-examining their cold cases with a renewed sense of purpose. When Cedar View's small police force received funding to implement this technology, Detective Dave Larson felt it was time to take another look at Malory Maynard's case. Detective Larson was known for his meticulous attention to detail. Having grown up in Cedar View, he had been a young officer when Malory was killed, and he remembered the case vividly. Larson sifted through the yellowed files, scanning through photographs of the crime scene, the autopsy reports, and witness statements, retracing the steps of those who had investigated before him. With funding secured, he was able to send the clothing Malory had worn that night, along with other pieces of evidence, to a specialized lab for DNA testing. Months later, the lab report returned with a discovery that would reignite the case. Traces of male DNA had been found on Malory's clothes and on the gear shift of her car. However, the DNA did not match Alex Simmons or any other known suspect. The profile was run through national databases, but frustratingly, it yielded no matches. For Detective Larson, it was a haunting reminder that Malory's killer was still out there, unidentified, and perhaps living an ordinary life while her family continued to grieve. The following years saw new techniques added to the field of DNA analysis, one of the most groundbreaking being genetic genealogy. By comparing DNA to distant relatives, investigators were now able to trace unknown profiles back to specific family lines. But it wouldn't be until 2018 that the Cedar View Police Department received the breakthrough they'd long awaited. Detective Larson handed over the case to investigator Mike Daniels, a seasoned genetic genealogist with an eye for unraveling complex family webs. Daniels' work was methodical. By analyzing the unknown DNA and cross-referencing it with public genealogy databases, he painstakingly constructed a family tree. The web led to a particular branch of a family residing not far from Cedar View. And as Daniels narrowed his search, he isolated 3 brothers who fit the demographic profile. Among them was a man named Jared Burke. Jared Burke was not a name familiar to most of Cedar View, but his quiet life concealed a disturbing possibility. With this new information, detectives took steps to secure a DNA sample from Jared, legally permissible because of their narrowed investigation. When the sample came back as a perfect match to the DNA from the crime scene, Cedar View's most haunting cold case was about to unravel. In early 2019, with Jared Burke's DNA linking him directly to Malory Maynard's murder, the Cedar View Police Department faced the chilling reality that they were dealing with a suspected killer who had evaded justice for 40 years. Jared Burke was 59, a soft-spoken construction worker who had spent his entire life in the neighboring town of Maple Ridge, just 20 miles from Cedar View. His record was clean. He'd never been arrested or even cited for a misdemeanor, blending seamlessly into his surroundings. But the DNA evidence was undeniable. Before making a move, Detective Mike Daniels and his team conducted a meticulous investigation into Burke's past. They looked for any hints that might connect him to Malory. Interviews with former neighbors, schoolmates, and coworkers turned up little. No one seemed to recall him ever mentioning Cedar View. And he had no known association with Malory or her circle of friends. To those who knew him, Jared Burke was as ordinary as they came, a man who went to work, paid his bills, and lived quietly. The lack of any clear motive or known connection to Malory made the case both more compelling and troubling. Investigators wondered if Burke had been a stranger to Malory, randomly choosing her as a target, or if he'd been watching her from a distance. While it was possible that he'd acted impulsively, his clean history raised another unsettling question: was this his only crime, or were there other victims whose cases had never been solved? In March of 2019, Cedar View law enforcement, with the support of Maple Ridge Police, finally arrested Jared Burke. Media outlets quickly picked up the story, and the case drew national attention, rekindling interest in Malory Maynard's brutal murder and the effects in DNA technology that had finally led to an arrest. Reporters flooded Cedar View, hoping to capture every detail of the unfolding story, while residents grappled with the shock that a suspected killer had lived so close for so long. The police had what they believed was indisputable evidence: Burke's DNA matched the traces found on Malory's clothing and in her car. Nevertheless, their investigation into Burke's potential motivations continued. Detectives examined his digital footprint, financial records, and even his work schedule from that period, hoping for a thread that could explain his connection to the victim. But the details of Burke's life seemed unnervingly ordinary, and the police found no apparent reason why he would have attacked an 18-year-old choir mem in the winter of 1979. Burke, meanwhile, remained silent, refusing to offer any explanation. As he awaited trial, the community buzzed with theories and speculation. Some believed he must have been a predator who had struck before, while others thought he might have hidden a dark side from even those closest to him. But one fact remained inescapable. After decades of agonizing uncertainty, Cedarview finally had a name, a face for the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. With Burke in custody, prosecutors began assembling their case for trial. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. They would rely on the DNA evidence as the irrefutable link between Burke and Malory's murder. This connection, they argued, placed him at the scene of the crime, negating the need for a witness or a clear motive. In the eyes of the law, the DNA tie was enough to point to him as the perpetrator. Despite the strength of the evidence, Jared Burke's defense attorney, Carla Hemming, built a counter-narrative, one aimed at casting doubt on the reliability of the forensic technology used. Hemming argued that while DNA evidence was powerful, it was not without flaws. She cited examples where DNA transfers had occurred inadvertently, cases where traces had been carried from person to person. This, she argued, could explain how Burke's DNA had ended up on Malory's clothing and in her car. Hemming also suggested that the evidence left in storage for nearly 40 years could have been contaminated. The prosecution prepared for the defense's angle, knowing that the DNA evidence alone would not go unquestioned. They reinforced their findings with testimonies from forensic experts who attested to the reliability of the technology used to analyze the samples. Experts argued that while accidental transfer was possible, it was highly unlikely, especially given the location of the DNA traces on the gear shift and Malory's clothing. These placements strongly indicated close, physical contact on the night of the murder. Meanwhile, Malory's friends and family waited anxiously for the trial's beginning. Her mother, Donna, took solace in knowing that the day she had waited for had finally arrived. After 4 decades, her daughter's killer would face justice in the same courtroom where families of Cedarview's newest generations would eventually seek their own rights. The weight of the trial was immense, not only for Malory's family but also for the town, which had lived under the shadow of her unsolved murder for so long. As the trial date approached, whispers emerged that investigators were considering possible links between Burke and other unsolved cases in the area. In towns surrounding Cedarview, several cold cases bore eerie similarities to Malory's murder cases, involving young women found dead under mysterious circumstances. Although no solid evidence tied Burke to these incidents, the coincidences were enough to warrant additional scrutiny. In January 2020, the trial of Jared Burke opened in Cedarview's courthouse. Reporters from across the country crowded the small Iowa town, setting up cameras and conducting interviews outside the court each day. The trial promised to be a landmark case, not only due to its grisly details but because it was a stark demonstration of how modern forensic science could resurrect long-cold cases. The prosecution's opening arguments painted Burke as a predator who had lurked in the shadows for decades, evading justice, while Malory Maynard's family suffered without answers. They laid out their case methodically, starting with the original investigation, emphasizing the brutal nature of the attack minus stab wounds, a number that indicated intense rage and personal involvement. They reminded the jury that while no connection had initially been found between Burke and Malory, the DNA evidence was incontrovertible. Burke's DNA was present on her clothing and on the gear shift of her car, places that could only have been reached through close contact. The prosecution called their forensic experts to the stand, professionals who meticulously described the process by which the DNA had been identified and matched to Burke. Dr. Angela Clark, a senior forensic analyst, explained how the samples had been stored, tested, and retested for accuracy. She spoke with authority, dispelling any notion of contamination or mishandling. Dr. Clark went further, explaining that such a precise DNA match was, statistically, nearly impossible to have occurred by chance or transfer. To bolster their case, the prosecution shared emotional testimony from Malory's mother, Donna Maynard. Her presence was a powerful reminder of the personal toll this crime had exacted. Donna, her voice shaking with grief and age, recounted the horror of losing her only daughter and the long, agonizing wait for answers. She described the small rituals she carried out each year, visiting Malory's grave, keeping her bedroom untouched a shrine to a life cut short. Her testimony left a powerful impression on the jury, one that no scientific data could replicate. Jared Burke's defense team faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was damning, but Carla Hemming, his lead attorney, was determined to cast doubt on the strength of the forensic case. In her opening statement, she contended that the state had no evidence directly linking Burke to Malory on the night of her murder, no witness to place him at the scene, and no weapon recovered from his property. Hemming argued that while DNA might indicate Burke's presence in Malory's car, it did not prove that he had been the one to commit the murder. The defense strategy centered on the idea of DNA transfer, a contentious argument that suggested Burke's DNA might on Malory's clothing or the car's gear shift through secondary contact. Hemming brought in her own forensic specialists, experts who warned the jury about the halo effect in DNA evidence interpretation. These experts described scenarios where tiny traces of DNA could potentially be transferred from person to person through shared spaces or objects, though they admitted such transfer was improbable in the specific context of this case. In an unexpected move, Hemming presented Burke as a man of integrity and deep faith, a churchgoer and a dependable worker known to his community as respectful and reserved. She highlighted his lack of any criminal record, describing him as a man who had lived quietly, with no history of violence or questionable behavior. Friends and family members testified to his character, describing him as humble and hardworking, a man who preferred solitude and had few close connections. To further shake the jury's confidence in the state's case, Hemming hinted at a conspiracy within law enforcement, suggesting that the police, desperate to solve Cedar View's most infamous cold case, had rushed to judgment. She accused investigators of tunnel vision, ignoring other leads and focusing only on Burke once his DNA surfaced. The defense's strategy aimed to plant a seed of doubt, knowing they needed only to sway a single juror to avoid a unanimous conviction. Burke himself remained impassive throughout the trial, his expression unreadable, as if detached from the gravity of the proceedings. His demeanor left a strange impression on the courtroom, one that added to the uncertainty and questions surrounding his involvement. As the trial entered its third week, a dramatic development shifted the courtroom's atmosphere. The prosecution revealed that they had uncovered evidence potentially linking Jared Burke to another unsolved murder from 1983, involving a young woman named Rachel Sanderson in a nearby town. Like Malory, Rachel had been found stabbed to death in her car, her injuries bearing a disturbing resemblance to those inflicted on Malory. This new revelation caused a stir. Prosecutors argued that this pattern showed Burke's capacity for violence and hinted that Malory's murder was not an isolated incident. Investigators had reopened Rachel's case, submitting newly discovered evidence for DNA analysis. And although it had not yet returned a match, the similarities between the two crimes were too striking to ignore. The defense objected vehemently, insisting that introducing evidence from an unrelated case was prejudicial and that no conclusive link existed between Burke and the second murder. But the judge allowed the information to be shared, ruling that the prosecution could use it to demonstrate a possible pattern of behavior. The new evidence was enough to sway public opinion further against Burke. In the court of public perception, Jared Burke was no longer a quiet, unassuming man, but a possible serial killer who had slipped through the cracks for decades. The specter of other victims loomed, casting Burke in a darker, more sinister light, even as his attorney fought to keep the focus on the specifics of Malory's case alone. The closing arguments were tense and charged with emotion. Prosecutors reminded the jury of the brutality of Malory Maynard's murder, the chilling similarities to Rachel Sanderson's case, and the indisputable DNA evidence that placed Jared Burke at the scene. They described Burke as a man who had hidden in plain sight for decades, using his quiet demeanor to evade suspicion, while carrying a darkness that few had ever suspected. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the science. DNA did not lie, they insisted, and it was a technology that had finally exposed Burke's guilt after 40 years of evasion. On the other side, Carla Hemming, Burke's defense attorney, made a last plea for reasonable doubt. She contended that the DNA evidence, while significant, did not prove murder. She reiterated the possibility of accidental DNA transfer and argued that Burke's spotless record and lack of any known connection to Malory raised serious doubts. Hemming argued that Burke's stoic demeanor had been misinterpreted, twisted into something sinister, when in reality he was simply a private man. She warned the jury against convicting an innocent person based on circumstantial evidence and the sway of public opinion, appealing to them to consider the gaps in the prosecution's story. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The weight of the case bore down heavily, and the public awaited the decision with bated breath. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict. Jared Burke was found guilty of first-degree murder in the case of Malory Maynard. The decision set off a wave of reactions: relief from Malory's family and friends, outrage from Burke's few supporters, and a mix of satisfaction and sorrow among the townspeople of Cedar View, who had lived with the mystery of her death for decades. Burke stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying no emotion. He would later be sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, a decision that gave some closure to Malory's loved ones, yet still left many questions unanswered. As Burke was led out of the courtroom, reporters and spectators whispered, wondering if this conviction might finally lead to answers in other unsolved cases in the region. Jared Burke's conviction was hailed as a landmark in the use of DNA and genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Cedar View's police department, which had once struggled to fund basic forensic procedures, became the subject of national praise as law enforcement agencies across the country looked to this case as proof of how old cases could be solved with modern technology. The prosecution team received commendations, and Detective Dave Larson, who had initiated the case's reinvestigation, was promoted. Yet for Cedar View, the victory was bittersweet. The details of Malory's final moments were still murky, and despite the conviction, many in the community struggled with the lack of a clear motive. Burke had never confessed, never hinted at why he might have killed Malory, or if he had known her at all. In interviews with the media, Donna Maynard expressed both relief and lingering pain, voicing the fear that she would never know why her daughter had been taken. She mourned the loss of the life Malory never got to live, the years she never got to grow up, attend college, or have a family. Rumors and suspicions continued to swirl as detectives quietly reopened investigations into other cold cases in the surrounding counties. They retraced Jared Burke's past, combing through travel records, employment history, and even contacting women he'd dated over the years, though few details emerged to suggest a pattern. However, whispers of unsolved crimes, missing persons, and strange disappearances from neighboring towns during the 1980s kept circulating, fueling fears that Burke's conviction might just be the beginning of a deeper, darker story. The resolution of Malory Maynard's murder sparked a renewed interest in justice for forgotten victims. Cedar View saw a swell in community-led projects, memorials, and scholarship funds in Malory's honor. For years, she had been remembered quietly, her legacy a haunting reminder of an unsolved mystery. Now she became a symbol of resilience and the triumph of science over secrecy.